Some films don't just disturb audiences, they detonate outrage. They trigger petitions, festival walkouts, government seizures, and headlines demanding bans. These are not mainstream horror hits with clever marketing campaigns. They exist in the shadows of distribution, whispered about in underground forums and traded in obscure collector circles. Critics have labeled them exploitative, unethical, even dangerous. Defenders call them transgressive art, pushing the limits of cinematic freedom. What unites them is their refusal to dilute brutality for comfort. They confront viewers with violence so explicit, so psychologically invasive, that entire countries have stepped in to suppress them. Some were banned outright, others were confiscated or forced into heavy cuts. Whether viewed as artistic expression or pure provocation, these films crossed lines that most studios would never approach. They became lightning rods for debates about censorship, morality, and the limits of what moving images should ever depict.
Melancholie der Engel, 2009. German director Marian Dora created Melancholie der Engel as a bleak meditation on nihilism, but its graphic imagery overshadowed philosophical intent. The film depicts extended sequences of sexual violence, animal cruelty, and degradation that shocked festival audiences. Reports of unsimulated acts fueled controversy and revulsion. Several countries refused classification, effectively banning public exhibition. Dora defended the film as an exploration of moral decay and spiritual emptiness, yet critics accused it of indulgent excess. Its length and unrelenting tone amplified discomfort, offering no conventional narrative structure or redemption. Viewers often described the experience as punishing rather than entertaining. Media outlets condemned its explicit content, sparking broader conversations about exploitation in art cinema. Melancholie der Engel exists largely in underground circulation, cited as one of the most extreme examples of transgressive filmmaking. Its notoriety rests not only on violence, but on the boundary it pushed between depiction and endurance.
Trauma, 2017. Chilean director Lucio A. Rajas crafted Trauma as a brutal commentary on generational violence rooted in dictatorship-era abuse. The film opens with an extended sequence of sexual assault that led to walkouts at international festivals. Several territories demanded cuts before granting release, while others refused classification entirely. Rajas defended the film as a political allegory exposing cycles of inherited brutality. Critics countered that its graphic imagery overwhelmed any thematic intention. The narrative follows two women targeted by a father and son shaped by historical trauma. Violence escalates in confrontational fashion, leaving little room for emotional distance. Media coverage highlighted its extremity, often overshadowing discussion of its political message. Trauma became emblematic of modern exploitation cinema pushing boundaries in the digital age. Its notoriety stems from the intensity of its opening and the relentless cruelty that follows, ensuring widespread outrage and polarized reactions.
Where the Dead Go to Die, 2012, directed by Jimmy Screamer Claus, Where the Dead Go to Die uses computer animation to depict graphic violence, sexual abuse, and taboo subject matter. Its crude visual style contrasts sharply with its disturbing themes, creating jarring dissonance. The anthology structure follows interconnected stories of corruption and depravity. Several distribution platforms refuse to carry it, citing extreme content. Critics described the film as intentionally confrontational and morally abrasive. Supporters argued it represented unfiltered artistic expression outside mainstream constraints. Media outrage centered on its depiction of minors and graphic scenarios, prompting calls for bans. The animated format intensified debate about boundaries in non-live action media. Where the Dead Go to Die occupies a niche within underground horror, known more for controversy than accessibility. Its existence continues to provoke discussion about censorship, digital distribution, and the evolving limits of artistic provocation.
The Bunny Game, 2011. Directed by Adam Rethmeyer, The Bunny Game follows a homeless woman who becomes the captive of a sadistic truck driver. Shot in stark black and white, the film presents prolonged scenes of physical and psychological torment. Its raw, unfiltered approach led to bans in several countries, including the United Kingdom, where authorities cited sexualized violence and extreme degradation. The lead actress, Rodleen Getzig, reportedly pushed herself through punishing sequences that blurred performance and endurance art. Critics argued the film crossed ethical boundaries by immersing viewers in relentless abuse without narrative relief. Supporters described it as confrontational social commentary on exploitation and trauma. Regardless of interpretation, its graphic imagery and sustained cruelty ignited media backlash. The Bunny Game became synonymous with debates about artistic freedom versus harmful content, cementing its reputation as one of the most controversial underground films of the 21st century.
Slaughtered Vomit Dolls, 2006. Directed by Lucifer Valentine, Slaughtered Vomit Dolls launched the so-called Vomit Gore trilogy. Blending horror with fetishistic imagery, the film features graphic depictions of bulimia, self-harm, and exploitation. Its chaotic editing and abrasive sound design intensify viewer discomfort. Distribution was limited to underground channels, as mainstream outlets rejected its content outright. Critics condemned the film for glamorizing eating disorders and degrading its performers. Valentine defended his work as surreal horror confronting addiction and trauma, though few accepted that framing. Media outrage focused on the ethical implications of portraying real bodily harm in stylized form. Many countries refused classification due to explicit sexual and violent content. Slaughtered Vomit Dolls became a symbol of extreme underground cinema, cited frequently in debates about taste and censorship. Its reputation endures less for narrative innovation and more for the visceral shock it inflicted on unprepared audiences.
Philosophy of a Knife, 2008. Andrei Iskanov's Philosophy of a Knife blends historical reenactment with graphic horror to depict atrocities committed by Japan's Unit 731 during World War II. Running over 4 hours, the film intercuts interviews with staged torture sequences that many viewers found unbearable. Its explicit portrayals of medical experimentation ignited controversy across multiple territories. Critics accused it of exploiting real historical suffering for shock value. Supporters argued that confronting brutality head-on prevents sanitization of war crimes. Several countries restricted or banned screenings due to extreme violence. The film's docudrama structure complicates categorization, blurring lines between education and exploitation. Media discussions centered on whether such graphic representation serves remembrance or sensationalism. Philosophy of a Knife remains largely inaccessible through mainstream distribution, known primarily through reputation. Its unflinching imagery ensured that any conversation about it revolved around censorship, ethics, and the limits of depicting historical atrocity on screen.
Outrage, 2015. Mexican horror film Outrage, directed by Lex Ortega, centers on found footage tapes documenting torture and murder. Its gritty aesthetic and explicit brutality resulted in bans and heavy censorship in multiple regions. Authorities cited extreme violence and sexual assault as grounds for restriction. The film positions itself as commentary on systemic corruption and societal decay, yet its graphic depictions dominate viewer response. Festival screenings sparked heated debate about artistic merit versus gratuitous shock. Ortega described the project as a critique of media sensationalism and impunity. However, critics argued that its relentless cruelty undermined thematic ambition. Underground horror communities embraced its uncompromising tone, amplifying its notoriety. Outrage became synonymous with extreme Latin American horror, challenging regulatory standards. Its distribution struggles and confiscations fueled media narratives portraying it as dangerously transgressive, reinforcing its reputation as a film that crossed acceptable limits in pursuit of raw confrontation.
Orozco the Embalmer, 2001. Directed by Kiyotaka Tsurasaki, Orozco the Embalmer is a documentary rather than fiction, yet its graphic content rivals exploitation cinema. Filmed in Colombia, it follows an embalmer working amid constant violent deaths. Real corpses, autopsies, and injuries appear on screen without censorship. Viewers were shocked by the absence of narrative cushioning or commentary. Several countries restricted exhibition due to disturbing imagery. Tsurasaki defended the film as verite documentation of social reality. Critics questioned whether the camera's gaze crossed ethical boundaries.
Media coverage fixated on its uncompromising visuals, often labeling it one of the most disturbing documentaries ever made. Unlike staged horror, its images cannot be dismissed as fiction. Orozco the Embalmer ignited debate about voyeurism and responsibility in documentary filmmaking. Its reputation stems from the raw immediacy of death presented without mediation, prompting outrage about what should or should not be shown publicly.
Tumbling Doll of Flesh, 1998. Directed by Tamakichi Inaru, Tumbling Doll of Flesh is a Japanese underground horror film infamous for extreme depictions of torture and sexual violence. The narrative centers on a photographer who kidnaps and brutalizes a woman in prolonged sequences that test endurance. Grainy cinematography and claustrophobic framing intensify the sense of confinement. Distribution was largely confined to underground markets due to censorship barriers. Critics condemned its graphic content as exploitative and purposeless. Defenders cited it as an example of transgressive cinema challenging taboos. Media outrage followed whenever the film resurfaced in discussions of banned works. Its reputation rests on the sustained nature of its brutality rather than narrative complexity. Tumbling Doll of Flesh became a reference point in debates about extreme Asian horror. Authorities in several territories refused classification, ensuring it circulated primarily among collectors drawn by its notoriety.
Snuff 102, 2007. Argentine director Mariano Peralta's Snuff 102 attempts to simulate the production of a fictional snuff film. Structured partly as a pseudo-documentary, it intercuts staged interviews with graphic torture sequences. Several countries banned or heavily censored it due to explicit violence and sexual assault. Peralta framed the project as commentary on media exploitation and the myth of snuff cinema. Critics argued that reenacting such brutality risked replicating the harm it purported to critique. Festival screenings generated protests and heated debate. The film's grainy aesthetic and confrontational tone amplified perceptions of realism. Media reports often focused on whether its imagery crossed legal thresholds. Snuff 102 remains largely inaccessible through mainstream platforms, known primarily through controversy. Its notoriety stems from the deliberate blurring of fiction and documentary style, intensifying outrage and reinforcing its status as an underground lightning rod.
These films remain controversial not because they flirted with violence, but because they embraced it without compromise. Each sparked media backlash, censorship battles, or outright bans due to imagery deemed too extreme for public exhibition. Supporters often defend them as artistic expression, confronting darkness directly. Critics argue that depiction can become exploitation when limits vanish. Regardless of position, their impact on censorship debates is undeniable. They forced regulators, festivals, and audiences to confront uncomfortable questions about artistic freedom and responsibility. Many remain confined to underground circulation, their reputations amplified by prohibition. Whether viewed as transgressive art or gratuitous shock, they occupy a space beyond mainstream horror. Their legacy is not box office success, but notoriety. In crossing lines others respected, they ensured lasting discussion about how far cinema can go before society decides it has gone too far.